In the remote corners of West Virginia, there exists a stretch of dense, untamed forest known as the Forgotten Woods. Few people venture there, and fewer still speak of it. The land isn't marked on most maps, and even the locals warn against visiting. For generations, whispers have circulated about strange disappearances, eerie sounds, and things seen moving in the shadows that defy explanation. But no one had a concrete story to tell, only fragments, rumors, until Daniel Grady's family stumbled upon the woods. Daniel wasn't much of a thrill seeker. He was a rational man, a history teacher by trade, a family man with a wife and a son. He prided himself on his down-to-earth perspective and logical thinking. So when his brother-in-law proposed a weekend getaway in a secluded cabin at the edge of the Forgotten Woods, Daniel was skeptical but intrigued. His wife, Sarah, was excited for the trip, eager to escape their busy lives for a few days. Their 10-year-old son, Jack, loved nature and had been begging to go camping for weeks. Daniel agreed, despite the nagging feeling in the back of his mind. The locals' warnings about the Forgotten Woods had lodged somewhere deep in his consciousness, but he brushed them off as superstitious nonsense after all. There were no credible accounts of anything out of the ordinary happening there, just vague stories of people wandering into the forest and never coming back. He chalked it up to accidents, nothing more. The drive was uneventful, and the cabin was quaint, nestled at the edge of the towering trees. The first day passed peacefully, with Sarah reading by the fire, Daniel cooking over a rustic stove, and Jack exploring the nearby streams. The night was calm, the silence of the woods, deep and soothing, the kind that city life could never offer. It was on the second day that things began to change. Jack had wandered deeper into the forest, excited to explore. Daniel and Sarah were busy, preparing food and setting up for the evening, when they heard Jack's faint voice calling for help from the woods. "Mom! Dad! Come quick!" Daniel felt his heart lurch as he sprinted toward the voice, Sarah close behind him. They found Jack standing in a small clearing, his face pale, his hands shaking. "I found something," Jack whispered, pointing ahead. His eyes were wide with fear, something Daniel had never seen before in his usually adventurous son. Daniel looked down at Jack's feet and saw a large, perfectly circular patch of land where nothing grew. The trees around it bent inward unnaturally, as if leaning toward the circle. There was something deeply wrong with the place. The air felt heavier, colder, and a sickly sweet smell hung in the air, faint but noticeable. In the center of the circle was a stone, jagged and black, unlike anything Daniel had ever seen. Carved into its surface were strange symbols, primitive and sharp. They were impossible to recognize, yet disturbingly familiar, as if they were something older than language itself. The longer Daniel looked at the stone, the more his head began to throb, a dull ache that grew stronger the closer he got. Sarah tugged on Daniel's arm, her voice trembling. "We should leave this alone. It doesn't feel right," Daniel, ever the skeptic, nodded reluctantly, but he couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. They hurried back to the cabin, Jack unusually quiet, casting nervous glances behind him every few steps that night. Daniel awoke to the sound of something moving outside the cabin. It was subtle at first, just the soft crunch of leaves, the faint snap of twigs. But as he lay there in the dark, his senses sharpened by fear, he could hear it more clearly. Something, or someone, was walking just beyond the tree line, slowly, methodically, as if pacing around the cabin. Daniel's heart raced. He sat up in bed, straining to listen. Sarah was still asleep beside him, her breathing steady, unaware. But Jack was awake. Daniel could see his son standing by the window, peering out into the night, his small frame rigid with fear. "Dad?" Jack's voice was barely a whisper. "There's someone out there." Daniel's blood ran cold. He threw the covers off and approached the window, careful not to make a sound. When he looked outside, he saw nothing at first, just the endless trees, black and unmoving in the night. But then, as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw it, a figure, tall, impossibly tall, standing just at the edge of the woods. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its head cocked at an odd angle, as if observing the cabin with a twisted curiosity. It was dressed in rags, its skin pale and mottled, like something long dead. But the worst part, the part that made Daniel's stomach churn with a sickening dread, was its face. It had no eyes. Just his face. It had no eyes. Just hollow sockets, black as the void. Its mouth was wide, too wide, stretching across its face in a grotesque grin. It stood perfectly still, watching them, for what felt like an eternity. Daniel couldn't move, couldn't breathe, raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but no explanation came. The thing outside was not human. It couldn't be. And then, as if sensing Daniel's realization, the figure took a step forward. Daniel grabbed Jack, pulling him away from the window. He rushed to wake Sarah, his voice shaking as he explained what he'd seen. She didn't question him. One look at his face told her he wasn't imagining things. They huddled together in the cabin, every sound outside amplified. The oppressive silence. The footsteps came again, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin like a predator stalking its prey. By dawn, the noises stopped, but none of them dared to sleep. The next morning, Daniel insisted they leave. Sarah didn't argue, and Jack was eager to go. They packed quickly, their nerves frayed, and hurried to the car. As they drove away from the cabin, Daniel glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of trees, watching them leave. But the woods were empty. It wasn't until they returned home that they realized how much had changed. Jack was different. He was quieter, more withdrawn. He refused to talk about what he had seen in the woods. And he became obsessed with locking windows and doors, checking them multiple times before bed. Daniel and Sarah tried to reassure him, but deep down, they felt it too. That lingering sense of dread, as if something had followed them home. And then, the nightmares began. Every night, Daniel dreamed of the figure, its hollow eyes, its twisted grin in the dream. It would stand at the foot of his bed, watching him with an unnatural stillness, its long fingers twitching ever so slightly, if waiting for something. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, and every time he checked the window, it would be locked. But that did little to calm his nerves. The dreams became more frequent, more vivid, until Daniel began to dread going to sleep at all. One night, after yet another nightmare, Daniel got up to check on Jack. He opened his son's bedroom door and froze. Jack was sitting by the window, staring out into the night. His small hand was resting on the glass, and for a moment, Daniel's heart stopped as he followed Jack's gaze. The figure was standing outside, just beyond the window, grinning. Daniel rushed to pull Jack away, but when he touched his son, Jack turned to him with wide, terrified eyes. "He wants to come in, Dad," Jack whispered. "He said he's been waiting for us." Daniel yanked Jack away from the window and slammed the curtains shut, his hands shaking. He didn't sleep that night. None of them did. The next morning, Daniel decided they couldn't stay in the house any longer. They packed up and moved to a different city, hoping distance would keep whatever was haunting them at bay. For a while, things seemed normal. The nightmares stopped, and Jackmares stopped, and Jack slowly began to return to his old self. But one night, months after they had moved, Daniel woke up to a familiar sound. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps outside the house. He bolted upright in bed, his pulse racing. He knew, deep bolted upright in bed, his pulse racing. He knew, deep down, what he would see if he looked outside, but he couldn't stop himself. He crept to the window and pulled back the curtain just a crack. The figure was there, standing in the yard, grinning up at him. It had found them, and it wasn't going to leave. The terror in the forgotten woods had followed them, and no matter where they went, it would always know where they were. Daniel realized too late that the thing in the woods wasn't bound to a place. It had chosen them, marked them, and now it was only a matter of time before it got what it wanted. The door was locked, the windows sealed, but deep down, Daniel knew, locks wouldn't keep it out forever.